Welcome back to Silent Paws and Bravehearts. The first thing people noticed about Jack Sullivan was not the pickaxe in his hand, it was his silence. In a valley full of men who talked loudly about everything they had done and everything they planned to do, Jack Sullivan said almost nothing. He worked, he walked, he watched the mountains, and when the ranchers rode past his hillside on a cold October morning and saw an old man with frost-white hair swinging a pickaxe into the frozen earth, they did not ask him what he was doing. They simply laughed. "Look at that," one of them called out, pulling his horse to a slow stop. His name was Harding, a broad-shouldered man who owned the largest spread of land in the valley. He looked down at Jack from the saddle with the easy, careless smile of a man who has never once doubted himself. "Old Sullivan's digging himself a grave." The other men laughed. It was the kind of laughter that carries farther than it needs to, the kind meant to be heard. Jack did not stop swinging. He did not look up. He drove the iron head of the pickaxe into the frozen clay and pulled back a chunk of dark earth, and then he did it again. His breathing was slow and even despite the cold, and the only acknowledgement he gave those men was the thin cloud of breath that rose from his mouth and disappeared into the October air. Beside him, sitting perfectly still on the hard ground, was Max. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not chase after the horses. He simply turned his large amber eyes toward the men on the ridge, let out one long, low sound from deep in his chest, and then turned back to watch Jack work, as if he alone understood what was being built, as if he alone understood what was coming. The riders moved on, and the valley went quiet again, except for the wind and the steady strike of iron against frozen earth. Jack Sullivan had come home from the war 7 years before, with nothing that showed on the outside and everything broken on the inside. He was not a man who spoke about what he had seen. He had watched boys younger than his own nephews die in the mud, had carried men on his back through fire and rain, had learned in the worst possible classroom that the world did not reward the good and did not spare the gentle. He had come home to this valley because his wife, Clara, had been born here, and because the mountains reminded him that some things in this world were still larger and older and quieter than the noise of men. But Clara was gone now. She had passed the winter before last, a quiet illness that moved through her the way cold moves through a thin wall, slowly, steadily, until there was nothing left to hold the warmth. Jack had sat beside her bed for 11 days, and on the 12th morning he had walked outside into the snow and stood there for a long time without moving, and Max had pressed his warm body against Jack's leg and stayed there. That was the thing about Max. He never left. Jack had found the dog during the war, a half-starved shepherd pup, abandoned in a bombed-out farmhouse, ribs showing, eyes wide with the kind of fear that lives deeper than hunger. Jack had tucked the dog inside his coat on a freezing night march, and somewhere between that night and every night that followed, the two of them had made an agreement that neither of them could put into words. They belonged to each other. That was all. That was enough. Now they lived together in a small wooden cabin at the base of a mountain, and every morning Jack woke to frost on the inside of the walls and wind pushing through the gaps in the boards, and he lay there listening to the cold and thinking about the same thing he had been thinking about since the first hard winter after Clara died. This cabin would kill him. Not all at once, slowly, the way the cold kills everything slowly, taking a little more each season until one morning a man simply does not wake up. Jack had seen enough death to recognize its patience, and he was not afraid of dying, but he was not ready to give in to something as impersonal and indifferent as a cold winter. He had survived too much for that. And so he started digging. The idea had come to him from a memory. During the war, he had spent 3 weeks sheltering in a tunnel dug by military engineers beneath a French hillside. The bombs had shaken ground above them, and the world above had been pure chaos, but inside that tunnel it had been quiet, and it had been warm. Warmer than anything he had felt in months. One of the engineers, a thin young man from Ohio who carried a surveying notebook everywhere he went, had explained it to Jack one night while they ate cold rations by a small lamp. "The earth holds heat, sir," the young man had said. "Below the frost line, the ground stays almost the same temperature year-round. Not hot, but stable. 45, maybe 50 degrees without any fire at all. You add a small fireplace and proper ventilation, and you've got something warmer than most houses and stronger than any of them." Jack had never forgotten that. He chose the hillside behind his land because the rock there was softer and the angle would allow for drainage and ventilation. He measured by eye and by instinct, and by the quiet knowledge of a man who had spent years reading terrain the way others read books. He started with a narrow trench and worked inward, following the natural contour of the hill, driving deeper each day into the frozen clay and stone. The work was brutal. His hands, already thickened by decades of labor and war, blistered in the first week and bled through the second. There were mornings when he could barely close his fingers around the handle of the pickaxe, when the cold turned his joints to stone, and every swing sent a shudder of pain through his shoulders. He worked anyway, slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything. Max stayed close. On most days, the dog sat at the edge of the work, watching the entrance of the tunnel with those steady amber eyes, occasionally rising to pace a slow circle around the site before returning to his spot. Sometimes, when Jack stopped to rest and leaned against the cool earthen wall with his eyes closed, he would feel Max's warm muzzle press gently against his hand, as if checking, as if making sure. The townspeople continued to talk. Women mentioned Jack Sullivan in low voices at the general store. Men shook their heads over coffee. Harding told anyone who would listen that the old veteran had finally lost what was left of his mind, that grief and solitude had done what the war had not quite managed to finish. Jack heard some of it when he came into town for supplies. He bought what he needed, said what was necessary, and rode back up to the mountain. He reinforced the tunnel walls with thick pine beams cut from deadfall timber on his own land. He packed the gaps with wet clay that dried hard as brick. He carved the chamber wider and taller until a man could stand upright inside without ducking, until 2 men could lie down beside each other and still have room. He built a small stone fireplace against the back wall, each stone chosen carefully and fitted without mortar, held in place by weight and geometry, the way the old builders had done it. Then came the chimney. This was the piece that took the most thought. He needed the smoke to escape, but he needed the vent positioned in a way that wind could not push back down into the shelter, and that snow could not fill the opening. He spent 4 days on this problem alone, sketching in the dirt with a stick while Max watched him with an expression of patient attention before he found the answer. He carved an angled shaft through 15 feet of earth, bending it twice before it emerged from the hillside behind a natural shelf of overhanging rock. The opening was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, and the angle meant that wind pushed across it rather than down into it, creating a natural draw that pulled the smoke out cleanly. The first night he lit a small fire inside the chamber and sat on the earthen floor with Max curled against his side. Jack felt something he had not felt in a long time. Warm. Not the desperate, costly warmth of a fire burning inside a drafty wooden box. A deep, held warmth that seemed to come from all sides at once. The earth itself held the heat like cupped hands. Outside, the November wind moved across the valley, but inside the mountain it was as still and quiet as a church.
"What do you think, old boy?" Jack said quietly, scratching behind Max's ear. The dog looked up at him with those deep amber eyes and let out a long, slow breath and settled his head against Jack's thigh. That was answer enough. November moved into December, and December sharpened into something meaner than any winter the valley had seen in living memory. The old-timers could feel it in their bones before the clouds even arrived, a pressure in the air like the sky itself was holding its breath. The animals felt it too. Cattle moved restlessly against fence lines. Birds disappeared from the fields 2 full weeks before the storm. Jack had felt it since October. He had felt it the way soldiers feel an ambush before they see it, in the quality of the silence, in the way the wind came from directions it did not usually come from. He stocked the shelter with dried meat, flour, lamp oil, blankets, firewood, and medicine. He cut twice as much wood as he thought he would need, and then cut more. On the 14th of December, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began to scream. By nightfall, the snow was falling so thickly that Jack could not see the tree line from his cabin door, and by midnight, the cabin itself was groaning under the weight above it. He took what he needed, called Max, and walked through chest-high drifts to the hillside entrance, pushing through the low wooden door he had built into the tunnel and pulling it shut behind him. Inside, the shelter was warm. Outside, the world was coming apart. He did not know how long the storm had been raging when, on the second night, Max lifted his head from the floor. The dog had been sleeping, one ear twitching now and then at the sound of the wind, but now he was fully awake and fully still, the way a dog goes still when it hears something that has not yet made itself known to human ears. He rose to his feet slowly, turned toward the tunnel entrance, and began to bark. Not frantically, steadily, with intention, each bark deliberate, as if he were knocking on a door himself. Jack was on his feet before the barking stopped. He took his lantern and moved through the tunnel and pressed his ear against the wooden door, and through the howling of the storm, he heard it. A voice, weak, ragged, barely there. He opened the door.
3 figures fell through the opening and collapsed onto the earthen floor. A man and a woman, both so cold their lips had turned a pale, frightening blue, and between them a small child of perhaps 4 years, wrapped in a wool coat that was already stiff with ice. The man looked up at Jack with eyes that were barely focusing. "We saw the smoke," he managed, "followed the smoke." Jack got the fire higher. He pulled every blanket from his store and covered all 3 of them, and set a pot of water to heat, and knelt beside the child first, the way he had been trained long ago to assess the most vulnerable first. The girl was cold but breathing. Her fingers were stiff but not black. He wrapped her hands in warm cloth and held them and did not let go until the color began to return. Max lay down beside the child without being asked, pressing his warm body along her length, and the little girl, half conscious and trembling, reached out in the dark and found the dog's fur and held on. Jack worked through the night without sleeping. Before dawn, Max barked again. A ranch hand this time, a young man named Thomas, who worked for one of the larger farms south of town, had become lost in the white blindness of the storm and wandered for 3 hours before the faint thread of smoke had pulled him to the hillside entrance. Then an old prospector who knew these mountains better than any man alive, but had been caught too far from shelter when the second wave of the blizzard hit. Then, in the gray light of what might have been morning, a young woman appeared at the door with a newborn wrapped against her chest, her face so pale and still it stopped Jack's heart for one terrible moment before he saw the baby move. Each time, Max heard them first. Each time, Jack opened the door. By the time the storm finally broke on the 5th day, 9 people were sheltering inside the chamber Jack Sullivan had carved out of the mountain that they had all watched him dig, and all laughed about, and all dismissed as the harmless obsession of a broken old man. They slept in shifts beside the fire, sharing food and warmth and the particular quiet that comes over people who have been frightened together and survived together. Nobody talked much. There was nothing that needed saying. When the light finally came back and they pushed open the tunnel door and walked out into the silence of a valley buried under 8 feet of snow, Jack stood at the entrance for a long moment and looked out at a world that was white and still and entirely changed. 3 cabin roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. 2 families from the northern edge of the valley had not made it through. The general store had lost its front wall. The church steeple was gone. Harding stood beside Jack in the snow, the big rancher's voice quiet for the first time in Jack's memory. "I owe you an apology," he said. He did not look at Jack when he said it. He looked at the valley. "I owe you more than that." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Just learn from it. That's enough." In the weeks that followed, men came to the mountain not to laugh, but to learn. They came with their hats in their hands and their pride set aside, and Jack showed them how to read the terrain, how to find the frost line, how to set a pine beam and pack clay and angle a ventilation shaft so the smoke moves cleanly and the cold stays out. He showed them everything the young engineer from Ohio had taught him in a tunnel beneath a French hillside during the worst years of his life. And Max walked among all of them, the big German shepherd moving slowly from person to person with a dignity that made grown men reach down to touch his head, as if being near him meant something, as if the dog who had stayed beside a lonely man on a cold hillside while the whole town laughed had earned something that could not be put into words.
The valley rebuilt. Spring came, as it always does, quietly and without ceremony, and the snow pulled back from the mountains, and the fields turned from white to brown to green. Jack expanded the shelter that summer, adding a second chamber and a deeper food store and a wider ventilation system, because he understood now that what he had built was not just for himself. It never really had been. He had built it the way soldiers build things in wartime, not because they are certain they will need it, but because they have learned that certainty is a luxury the world rarely offers, and preparation is the only honest answer to that truth. He had built it because Clara would have told him to, because Max had stayed beside him while he did, because a boy from Ohio with a surveying notebook had once explained to a tired soldier that the earth itself, if you were willing to trust it, would hold you warm. Some things in this world do not announce themselves. They do not come with speeches or applause or any recognition at all. They come quietly, built by quiet hands, watched over by quiet eyes, in the cold and the early mornings, when no one is looking and no one is clapping, and the only company is a loyal dog sitting at the edge of a trench, watching the horizon. That is where the real courage lives. Not in the loud moments, in the long, cold, unwitnessed ones, in the decision to keep digging when everyone around you has decided you are already defeated. Jack Sullivan knew that. Max had always known it. And now, finally, so did the valley. If this story moved something inside you, if you believe that quiet courage deserves to be remembered, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Every week we bring you stories of loyalty that never made the headlines, of veterans and their dogs, of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in silence. Hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a single story. These are the stories worth keeping. Thank you for being here.